In this video, I want to talk about the 5 mistakes that I used to make all the time when I started in photography and that I see all the time in other photos and how to solve them. What's up guys, welcome back to another video. So there were 5 mistakes that I used to make all the time as a beginner photographer. I wasn't a very good photographer naturally, I didn't really know what I was doing, and so I made a ton of mistakes. Over time, as I started to shoot more and I started to look to other people's work to try to figure out what actually makes a good photo, I started to identify some of the mistakes that I was making and then work to try to resolve them. The good news is that all of these mistakes are really easy to fix, and it's really just having the awareness that you're making the mistakes in the first place. So the first mistake that I used to be guilty of a lot was shooting everything wide open, meaning shooting everything at the lowest possible aperture that your lens can go. When I first started out in photography, I had a really cheap crop sensor Nikon camera with a kit lens. And the kit lens is not very good and the aperture doesn't open very wide. When I finally got my hands on a decent lens, which happened to be a 35mm f1.8 lens, I was so excited that my aperture could open that wide that I started shooting everything completely wide open. Landscapes, portraits, street, basically anything I shot I was shooting at f1.8. I thought having a blurry background was the key to good photography. I see this a lot and I totally get it. Having a creamy background looks dope, but in the right setting. You have to remember that aperture is just a tool to achieve a certain photographic goal. I'll say that again. Aperture is just a tool to achieve a certain photography goal. When it comes to shooting portraits, the reason why a blurry background works so well is because it isolates the subject from the background and it draws the attention to the subject, which is what the goal is when you're shooting a portrait. If you shot a portrait at f9, for example, the background is distracting and kind of takes away from the subject in the photo. So when you're shooting a scene, let's say a landscape, for example, you have to ask yourself, what are you trying to capture with your image? What are you trying to convey? If you're trying to showcase the beauty of the place you're in by showcasing the landscape vista, let's say the mountains, the trees, the foreground, then you want all of that to be in focus and sharp. So it doesn't make sense to shoot that shot wide open, and in fact you're probably taking away from the photo because there's going to be areas of the photo that are not in focus. You have to start thinking about your camera settings in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, rather than just blindly setting your camera settings without thinking about it. When you set your aperture to a specific value, you should be able to answer the question why you're setting it to that value. Let's say you're shooting a group photo and you shoot it wide open. Is everyone's face going to be in focus? Probably not. And isn't everyone's face being in focus more important than having a blurry background? Yeah. The next mistake, which is just as common as the first but can be a little bit trickier to resolve, is setting your shutter speed too low. As a beginner, I remember I used to always overvalue the need to have a really low ISO. I used to think that my ISO had to be 100 or 200, otherwise my image would be way too noisy. This is just not the case. The problem with this mindset though was that oftentimes after I set my aperture and my ISO was locked at say ISO 100, the only way to properly expose my image would be to slow down my shutter speed. I would then have an image that wasn't sharp, and for the longest time I thought, oh, it has to be the camera, it has to be the lens. It wasn't. You kind of have to think about shutter speed and aperture differently than ISO. Shutter speed and aperture have very specific goals: to get your image sharp and in focus. If you shoot with an incorrect aperture, there's going to be parts of your image that are out of focus. Similarly, if you shoot with too slow a shutter speed, then you're going to have motion blur in your images, which is basically the same thing as it not being sharp. ISO just bridges the gap to get a proper exposure after you've already locked in your shutter speed and your aperture. And if you have a bit of noise in your images, so be it. At least your images are in focus. I talked about this in my beginner photography video, and I have a cheat sheet on this that I'll leave a link to in the description below. But basically, there are some quick and dirty rules that you can follow to get a proper shutter speed. If you're shooting people like portraits, then 1/200-ish is fine to be on the safe side. Sports are in the thousands, like 1/2000 or higher. And if you're shooting handheld, then your shutter speed should be at least double your focal length. So if you're shooting with a 50mm lens, then your shutter speed should be at least 1/100. What I tend to do now, just to ensure that my images are sharp, is I tend to set my shutter speed higher than I would think that I would need to. In my opinion, it's better to have a little bit more noise in your image just to ensure that you can get a higher shutter speed to make sure that your image is sharp, rather than the other way around and have no noise in your image, but your shutter speed is too slow and now your image is not sharp. You can apply noise reduction to your images in Lightroom anyway, and most cameras these days are getting really good at even higher ISOs. Mistake number 3 is not having a clear subject in the image. I used to do this one a lot. When I look back at some of my older photos, a common thought that I have is, what is this a photo of? What's the point of this image? When we look at a photo, whether you're conscious of it or not, your brain is immediately scanning for the subject of the image. It's why there's certain photography principles that work so well, like leading lines and like the rule of thirds. They lead your eyes to a subject in the photo. It's also why photos with people in them are so appealing to us, because it's a clear subject for our brain to look at. This can take some time to figure out on your own, but now that you've watched this, try to think about it every time you take a photo. Ask yourself, what is the subject of this photo? What do I want people to look at in this image? And is the way that you're framing the photo and the camera settings that you're choosing contributing to that goal? Just the simple act of thinking about this and being more intentional in the way that you shoot your photos is going to get you better at this over time. This is a mistake that I made very early on that I corrected pretty quickly, and that is not shooting in RAW. If you're shooting in JPEG, you end up with pretty decent images, but you lose a lot of the data in the image. Basically, when you shoot with a JPEG image, you get contrast, you get saturation, but all of it's baked into the image. It's why you can open up a JPEG image and it looks fine without really doing anything to it. When you open up a RAW image, you might think this looks terrible, but you get a lot more data in the image. You just have to edit the image. It's why RAW files are so much bigger when it comes to file size than JPEGs. That's not to say that you can't edit a JPEG image in Lightroom, you just can't play with it as much and you can't push things as far as you can with a RAW file. I'm always amazed at how well I can recover underexposed or overexposed images because I shoot in RAW. If you shoot in JPEG, you just can't do this. So at a minimum, I would recommend shooting in JPEG plus RAW. That way, if you don't want to edit your photos now because you're just starting out or whatever the reason, at least you have them so that you can go back and edit them later. And if you are shooting in JPEG, make sure that you're shooting in the highest quality JPEG possible for your camera. All right, this last mistake I see all the time, and I used to do it myself a lot in the beginning, and that is over editing. More specifically, cranking the saturation, the clarity, and the contrast sliders. When I look at some of my older photos, it pains me how saturated they are, how much vignetting I put on it, how much clarity is on it, and just how much contrast the image has. I get it, when you first get in Lightroom and you start increasing these sliders, they do make your images look better. The mistake though is to push these way too far. Like many things in life, less is more. Everyone is going to have different editing styles and preferences, I get it, and photos that look good to me may not look good to you, and vice versa. The point that I'm trying to make is just take it easy with the sliders. You don't need to pop it to 100 to make your photos look good. Hopefully, now that you've seen this video, you can avoid making some of the mistakes that I used to make and so many others make. And if not, that's okay. Learning comes from mistakes, and sometimes you have to make the mistakes for yourself to learn from them. If you found this video helpful, consider subscribing so that other people like you can benefit from it. I'll see you guys in the next video.
Leches on the Menje.